what you see in your mind's eye. A majestic figure seated upon a golden throne, draped in regal velvet, a heavy, jewel-encrusted crown resting. We imagine palaces of impossible grandeur, sprawling feasts that last for days, and a life of untouchable, almost divine perfection. This is a fairy tale we've been sold since childhood, a polished, gilded, and utterly magnificent lie. Because tonight, we are not visiting the grand throne room or the manicured royal gardens. We are sneaking down the damp, unlit back corridors, past the snoozing guards and the prying eyes of court, and into the chambers they never, ever wanted you to see. We are about to uncover the messy, the deeply embarrassing, and the shockingly human truth about the most powerful people in history. What if I told you that beneath the ermine robes were bodies racked with illnesses so strange they were treated with cures that were nothing short of pure torture? That behind the stoic, painted portraits were minds obsessed with foods, hobbies, and superstitions so profoundly insane they would bankrupt entire nations and steer the course of history on a whim? We pull back the heavy velvet curtain on the English crown to reveal the scandals, the secrets, and the sheer, jaw-dropping absurdity that your history books were far too polite and perhaps too scared to ever mention. From a king who required a dedicated team of 4 grown men to assist him on the toilet, to another who invented a version of tennis that was literally a death wish. These are the stories that prove that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it gets weird. Very, very weird. These are the moments where the myth of monarchy shatters, and we are left with the startling and often hilarious reality of flawed human beings stumbling through history with a crown perched crookedly on their heads. Before we descend into this magnificent madness, a small request from our Council of Secret Keepers. The stories we're sharing tonight have been buried for centuries, locked away in dusty archives, and whispered in forgotten letters. If you believe these truths deserve to finally see the light of day, help us by granting this channel a royal charter of your own. You can do that by bestowing a noble like upon this video, commanding the subscribe button to bend the knee and join our ranks, and leaving a comment in the chronicle below telling us which royal secret you are most excited to finally uncover. Now, lower the lights, pour yourself a gob of your finest beverage, and let's begin our clandestine journey into glorious, grotesque, and utterly unbelievable world of English royalty. The throne of humiliation, royal bathroom nightmares. Our first stop on this unorthodox tour is perhaps the most private place in any home. It was a stage of immense political power and profound, unavoidable vulnerability. Let's journey to the court of the infamous King Henry VIII. He was a dashing athlete, a true Renaissance prince, the envy of Europe. But by his final years, Henry was a tragic shadow of his former self, a suffering mountain of a man weighing nearly 400 pounds. His body was plagued by weeping, foul-smelling ulcers on his legs that reeked so badly. Courtiers claimed they could smell him coming from 3 rooms away. He had grown so enormous that a precursor to the modern crane had to be used to winch him onto his horse, and he was carried to his vast palaces in a specially designed chair by a team of straining servants. This precipitous physical decline led to the creation of one of the most prestigious, yet utterly mortifying, jobs in all of history. Now, let's be perfectly clear. In this context does not refer to a piece of furniture you might sit on in a tavern. It refers quite explicitly to the king's bowel movements. The man who held this extraordinary title was responsible for assisting the king with his most private and personal bodily functions. He was the keeper of the royal toilet paper, which at the time was fine linen cloth, the official monitor of the monarch's digestive health, and often the first and last person to see the king each day. He would be there to help the king undress, position him on the commode, an ornate, padded box called a close stool. Once the king was finished, he was responsible for the cleaning, both of the king and of the commode's pewter pot. It sounds like a cruel joke, a punishment disguised as a job, but this was no laughing matter in the Tudor court. The groom of the stool was one of the most powerful and sought-after positions a nobleman could attain, because intimacy equals power. This man was the king's most intimate confidant, his literal right-hand man in moments of extreme vulnerability. He controlled who had access to the king's private chambers. He managed the king's personal finances from a purse kept in a bedchamber, and he heard secrets of state, of love, of fear that could make or break empires. Noble families schemed, bribed, and fought for generations to place their sons in this role, a position of immense, unparalleled power wrapped in the most undignified package imaginable. But it gets even more absurdly complex. Henry's bathroom ritual was not a solo act. It was a fully staffed team effort. It required 4 grown men to function. Imagine that scene. The groom of the stool would officiate, overseeing the delicate operation. Two strong assistants were needed just to help maneuver the king's massive, pain-ridden frame onto the velvet-padded seat. A fourth attendant stood by with a basin of scented water, fresh linens, and expensive perfumes to combat the inevitable odors and maintain what was referred to, with a completely straight face, as royal dignity during these profoundly undignified moments. Royal account books, which still exist today in meticulous detail, show payments for these specially padded toilet seats, for imported fragrances from the Orient to massive smells, and even on occasion for musicians who were hired to stand outside the chamber doors and play soothing lute music to help the king relax. Let's fast forward 2 centuries to another royal bathroom tragedy, this one with a far more final and equally embarrassing outcome. On the seemingly ordinary morning of October 25th, 1760, the 76-year-old King George II woke up at Kensington Palace. He followed his usual routine. He enjoyed his morning cup of hot chocolate, chatted amiably with his valet, and then excused himself to use his private toilet, or as was known in the parlance of the time, the necessary house. His loyal servants waited patiently outside the door, as was customary. It was a perfectly normal morning, right up until a thunderous, sickening crash echoed from within the chamber, after a moment of terrified hesitation, because one simply did not burst on the king unannounced. No matter the circumstance, his valet worked up the courage to rush in. He found King George II sprawled on the cold stone floor dead. The official cause of death was announced as a heart attack, a perfectly respectable and dignified end for a monarch, which spread like wildfire through letters and diaries, told a different, more humiliating story. The king had been suffering from severe, debilitating constipation for weeks. The court physician later confided in his private diary that the king had died from excessive straining on the stool. He had literally strained so hard to perform a simple bowel movement that an artery in his heart had burst. His final words, spoken as valet just moments before he entered the necessary house, had been a grumpy complaint about his digestive troubles. He allegedly grumbled in his native German, "This business will be the death of me." Never have more prophetic or more tragically comical last words been spoken. The royal household was so profoundly mortified by the circumstances of his death, they spent hours crafting a delicate public announcement stating that he had simply died suddenly in his private chambers, carefully leaving out the grislier and far more human details of his final moments. Let the deadly games begin, royal hobbies from hell. You might think that for people with everything wealth, power, and limitless resources, entertainment would be a simple, but for English royalty, boredom was a mortal enemy, and they fought it with hobbies and pastimes so outrageously dangerous they made modern extreme sports look like a gentle game of checkers. No one embodied this reckless pursuit of amusement more than our old friend, King Henry VIII, especially in his younger, more athletic years. We all know Henry loved jousting, hunting, and wrestling, but his true, all-consuming passion was a unique and deadly version of tennis. This wasn't the genteel game of Wimbledon. The game of real tennis was played indoors in a long, narrow stone court. A man of extremes decided the game lacked a certain lethal edge. He ordered some royal modifications. According to the meticulous accounts from the royal armory, Henry commissioned tennis balls with a solid lead core, wrapped tightly in leather and stuffed with human hair, often gruesomely. The hair of recently executed prisoners, because even his sports equipment had to be macabre. These balls weighed nearly 2 pounds each and, when struck by a powerful player like Henry, could travel at speeds that would shatter bone. But that's not even the craziest part. He invented a version of the game where his courtiers were expected to catch these miniature lead cannonballs with their bare hands. It was a terrifying mix of tennis, dodgeball, and a brutal test of loyalty and courage. Court records from 1531 describe a particularly intense game was struck square in the chest by one of Henry's thunderous serves. He was knocked completely unconscious and didn't wake for over an hour. When he finally came to, gasping for air and likely with several cracked ribs, his first words were reportedly, "Your Majesty plays with exceptional vigor." Even on the brink of death, you had to compliment the king's athletic prowess. As if the lead balls were enough of a hazard, Henry's rackets were also death traps. The custom-made wooden handles were hollowed out and filled with mercury. A man with a rudimentary understanding of physics believed this liquid metal gave the rackets a perfect balance and a smoother, more powerful swing. What it actually did was slowly and insidiously poison everyone who played. The king's physician, Dr. William Butts, documented a mysterious plague of illnesses among Henry's regular tennis partners: uncontrollable tremors, severe memory loss, terrifying fits of rage, and what he called a madness of the spirit. We recognize these as the classic, horrifying symptoms of mercury poisoning. Henry's inner circle was literally being driven mad by their weekend sports, and no one had a clue. Henry's taste for blood and spectacle wasn't confined to the tennis court. When traditional hunting in the vast royal forest became too mundane for his taste, he invented palace hunts. These were not genteel excursions into the countryside. These were brutal hunts held inside the royal palaces. In 1536, still in a dark and volatile mood after executing his second wife in Bullen, Henry ordered his staff to release live deer, wild boar, and even a few captured wolves into the cavernous Great Hall of Westminster Palace. He and his courtiers then proceeded to hunt the terrified, cornered animals with crossbows, spears, and swords, all while a lavish dinner was being served at the high table. Imagine trying to enjoy your roasted swan while dodging stray arrows and leaping over a wounded. The Spanish ambassador, who witnessed this chaotic event, wrote home to his king that it was like dining in hell, if hell served excellent wine and was frequented by madmen. But Henry's most depraved and horrifying invention was a so-called sport he chillingly called human foxes. This is so monstrous that for centuries, historians assumed it was just a slanderous rumor until multiple court documents and independent accounts confirmed its existence. Henry would select prisoners from the Tower of London, often those convicted of minor crimes like debt or theft. He offered them a grim choice: face their scheduled execution or participate in a royal hunt where they were the prey. If they could survive and evade the king and his hunting party for a full day within the confines of a royal forest, they would be pardoned and given a bag of gold. The foxes had to wear bright red tunics and have loud bells tied to their ankles, making it nearly impossible to hide effectively. And the king's hunting dogs? They weren't dogs, and specially trained to track and corner human beings. Between 1538 and 1540, court records show that 23 desperate prisoners took this terrifying bargain. Only 2 survived. A baker named Thomas Miller, who had been imprisoned for stealing bread, later wrote a letter to his sister describing the ordeal. He said he survived by climbing a tall oak tree and clinging to it for 12 straight hours, listening to the baying of the wolves and the triumphant horns of the hunting, praying he wouldn't fall asleep. For English royalty, even their leisure time was a matter of life and death, and they usually made sure it was someone else's. The royal appetite, feast of madness and obsession. The royal dining table was the ultimate symbol of a monarch's power and wealth, a grand stage for magnificent feasts designed off foreign dignitaries and display the kingdom's boundless prosperity. But behind the glittering spectacle of gold plates and endless courses, some English monarchs had a relationship with food that was less about sustenance and more about a complete, unhinged obsession that defied all logic, reason, and sometimes even the laws of nature. King Henry VIII's appetite was, of course, legendary, but his gluttony wasn't just about quantity. It was about a bizarre, serial monogamy with food. Sometimes even years at a time, Henry would decide to eat only one specific type of food, and he would consume it in terrifying, almost industrial quantities, until he grew so sick of it that the very sight of it repulsed him, at which point he would move on to his next singular obsession. In the winter of 1542, he entered what his courtiers called his swan phase. For 4 straight months, every single meal that passed the king's lips was roasted swan. The royal kitchens were in a constant state of panic, having to slaughter over 400 swans to feed this singular craving. He didn't just eat the meat in a display of his all-consuming nature. He consumed almost the entire bird, the crispy skin, the rich organs, and he would even chew on the bones for their marrow. His personal physician wrote in his private journal that the king believed that by consuming the entire swan, he would mystically absorb its grace and beauty. It was a diet of pure magical thinking. It was so voracious that it nearly wiped out the swan population in several English counties. After the swan phase ended abruptly with a royal tantrum, Henry declared he would only eat fish. But, true to form, it couldn't be just any fish. It had to be fish caught by virgin fishermen, under the mystical light of a full moon. This was not a suggestion. It was a royal decree. The royal court had to dispatch agents to coastal villages to recruit and, through sworn testimony and church records, verify the chastity of teenage boys. These unfortunate youths were then housed in special camps, waiting for the full moon to go fishing for the king. The cost of this virgin fisherman program, as it became known in household accounts, was so astronomical that it exceeded the budget for the entire Royal Navy that year. To make matters even more complicated, Henry insisted the fish be served to him while it was still alive. This meant the fish had to be transported hundreds of miles from the coast to the king's court in special, aerated water tanks. tended by a dedicated team of fish whisperers, whose sole job was to keep the fish calm and alive so they wouldn't die of stress before reaching the royal table. After a particularly large and feisty live pike bit one of his servants during a dinner service, Henry renounced all fish and moved on to his final great food obsession. But again, it couldn't be just any honey. It had to come from bees that lived in beehives made of solid gold. This sounds like something from a fairy tale, but Henry was king, and what he wanted, he commissioned the royal goldsmiths to construct these glittering, absurdly expensive hives, believing that bees living and working in gold would produce a spiritually superior and more potent honey. The cost was so immense that the royal accounts list the golden beehives as being more valuable than several. This phase came to a painful end when Henry, attempting to give a motivational speech to one of his hives to encourage productivity, was stung over 200 times and spent a week recovering from the painful, swollen results. This food madness wasn't unique to Henry. King John, who ruled in the 13th century, had a fatal obsession with fruit. He became convinced, through no medical advice whatsoever, that eating fruit was the secret to achieving eternal life. He consumed staggering quantities, sometimes eating an entire bushel of apples for breakfast, followed by several pounds of pears for lunch. His fruit bills were so high they had to be paid for with special taxes levied on his subjects. In October 1216, after a military victory, he celebrated by gorging on a massive feast of imported peaches. Unfortunately for him, the peaches were out of season and had been preserved using a method that involved a lead-based solution. He died in agony a few days later, a victim of his own desperate quest for immortality, poisoned by his favorite food. His last words were reportedly a pained whisper, "The peaches, they taste of heaven and of death." Perhaps the strangest of all was a peculiar obsession of Queen Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary. Her obsession wasn't with a particular type of food, but with the specific conditions under which she ate it. Mary became convinced that food consumed in complete and utter darkness was more nutritious, as it could absorb the healing essence of the night. She would host elaborate state dinners in rooms where the windows were boarded up and not a single candle or torch was allowed. Servants had to learn to navigate the pitch-black rooms using a complex system of ropes and memorized steps, often tripping and spilling entire platters of food. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in utter bewilderment, describing these bizarre darkness dinners. One Venetian diplomat famously wrote, "I have dined with Her Majesty in conditions that would challenge a bat. Consumed what I believe was chicken, though in the absolute blackness. It might very well be my own sleeve." For these monarchs, the dinner table wasn't just a place to eat. It was a grand theater for their wildest, most dangerous, and most inexplicable obsessions. A royal pain, medicine, mayhem, and malpractice. If you fell ill in medieval or Tudor England, your chances of survival were already perilously slim. But if you were the king or queen, your chances, paradoxically, were even worse. Royal physicians, desperate to prove their worth and justify their exorbitant fees, didn't offer simple, sensible remedies. They provided treatments as grand, as expensive, and as theatrical as the monarchs they served. In the royal bedchamber, the cure was almost always more terrifying than the disease itself. Let's return one last time to the final, agonizing days of the suffering King Henry VIII. Once a nagging annoyance had become a festering, infected wound that threatened his life. His doctors, considered the finest in all of Christendom, began with a treatment they called royal bloodletting. They held the belief that a king's blood was fundamentally different, more potent, more sacred than that of a commoner. They couldn't use ordinary run-of-the-mill leeches. Instead, they imported virgin leeches from special breeding ponds in France, leeches that had never tasted human blood before. These creatures were pampered, fed exclusively on holy water and blessed wine for weeks, before being deemed worthy to touch the king's sacred skin. His doctors then took this horrifying concept to its extreme, covering his entire ailing body with over 200 of these leeches at once, believing this massive assault would suck the festering poison out of his royal person. The Archbishop Thomas Cranmer wrote in his private diary that the king appeared as a man covered in writhing black jewels, each one growing fat and bloated on his sacred blood. When that gruesome procedure, shockingly, didn't work, they moved on to a new and even more bizarre treatment they called celestial surgery. The court astrologer, a man of immense influence, had to calculate the exact moment when the planets were in a favorable alignment before the royal surgeons would even dare to make a single incision. This meant Henry often had to wait for days, even weeks, his infection worsening and the fever raging, because the stars were simply not in the right position for royal surgery. The universe had to give us permission before they would risk operating on the king. Their final, most desperate attempt to save him involved what they called unicorn medicine. Since actual unicorns were, then as now, in short supply, they used the next best thing, narwhal tusks, which were widely believed to be the horns of the mythical beast. They ground these priceless spiral tusks into a fine, shimmering powder, mixed it with crushed pearls and holy water, and fed it to the ailing king in massive quantities, believing the king required a king-sized dose of magic. We now know that narwhal tusks are mostly composed of calcium and other minerals. In the large doses Henry was consuming, they would cause severe digestive problems, painful kidney stones, and chronic dehydration. The king's doctors were essentially poisoning him with one of the most expensive and exotic substances on earth, all the while convinced they were administering a miraculous, divine cure. But perhaps no monarch suffered more bizarre and invasive medical treatment than Queen Anne, who ruled in the early 1700s. She suffered from terrible gout and what we would now recognize as severe autoimmune disorder. Her esteemed physicians decided her ailment was caused by a lack of animal magnetism in her royal blood. Their proposed solution was something they called living medicine. The procedure was as horrifying as it sounds. They made dozens of small incisions all over her arms and legs, and then inserted live creatures, wriggling worms, tiny fish, and even baby mice, directly into the wounds. They held the fantastical belief that these animals would swim around under her skin and literally eat the gout poison from the inside, purifying her blood. Queen Anne had to go about her royal duties, signing laws and meeting foreign ambassadors, with a veritable menagerie of small animals literally living and moving inside her body. She confided in the French ambassador that she could feel them moving around and had learned to time her public speeches to their periods of activity. The horrifying treatment was only stopped when one of the mice died and began to decompose inside her arm, causing a massive, life-threatening infection. Even then, her physicians didn't question the fundamental madness of their method. They simply concluded that they had used insufficiently royal mice and proposed trying again with more noble and robust breed. For the crowned heads of England, even medical care was a terrifying performance. A grotesque spectacle of suffering where the treatment was designed to be as extraordinary as the patient, regardless of whether it actually worked or simply hastened their agonizing demise. Love is a battlefield. Disastrous royal romances. We think of royal romances as the stuff of fairy tales, a love that unites kingdoms and brings peace to the land. Often a brutal, calculated, and breathtakingly destructive affair, where love wasn't a unifying force, but a powerful weapon of mass destruction. When royals fell in love, or even just into obsession, they didn't just break hearts. They broke nations, shattered alliances, and rewrote the course of history in blood and betrayal. The story of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn is a prime example, a romance that burned so hot it torched the religious foundations of a continent. We all know he broke with the Catholic Church to annul his first marriage in Make and his queen, but the story behind their courtship is a masterclass in psychological manipulation and wounded pride. Henry was the most powerful man in England, a supreme ego used to getting whatever and whomever he wanted. Women who flattered him and submitted to his desires were quickly conquered, and Boleyn, shrewd, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious, and took a radically different approach. According to her own private letters to her sister, she decided the surest way to capture and hold a king's attention was not to soothe his ego, but to wound his pride. She criticized him, she challenged his intellect, and, most audaciously of all, she told him he was terrible in bed. No one had ever dared to speak to Henry this way. He became utterly, single-mindedly obsessed with proving her wrong, with conquering the one woman who denied him. The English Reformation, the seismic event that severed England from Rome and changed the course of Western history forever, wasn't born from deep theological debate or sincere crisis of faith. It was born from one man's desperate, 6-year-long attempt to impress a woman who had insulted his romantic prowess and never truly loved him. It was a cold, calculated game to win a crown. But once she was queen, the game was over. She had promised him a son and heir, and she had failed to deliver. The man whose all-consuming obsession had lifted her to the throne turned that same obsessive energy into a murderous, paranoid rage. Her execution wasn't just a political necessity. It was deeply personal revenge from a man who felt he had been conned into changing the world for a woman who had played him for a fool. An even more catastrophic romance unfolded a couple of centuries earlier between the ill-fated King Edward II and a handsome nobleman named Piers Gaveston. From the very moment Edward became king in 1307, it was clear to the entire court that his heart belonged not to his queen, Chroniclers of the time, not known for their subtlety, wrote that the king loved him more than his own soul, and that this all-consuming love surpassed the love of women. Edward showered Gaveston with the highest titles, vast estates, and immense political power, essentially making his boyfriend the co-ruler and de facto king of England. The powerful English barons were incandescent with fury. It wasn't just because of the scandalous nature of their relationship, but because Gaveston was arrogant, cruel, and used his unchecked power to mercilessly humiliate them. He gave them mocking, childish nicknames in public, and hosted what he called love tournaments, bizarre spectacles where powerful, battle-hardened nobles were forced to perform humiliating tasks to prove their loyalty, such as writing and reciting fawning love poems about Gaveston's beauty. The final, unforgivable straw came at the coronation of Edward's own wife, Queen Isabella of France. Gaveston showed up to the sacred ceremony wearing the queen's priceless family jewels and sat in the place of honor right beside the king, and marginalizing the new queen at her own coronation. The nobles rose in open rebellion, launching a brutal civil war fought almost entirely over a royal relationship. They captured Gaveston in 1312 and brutally executed him. Edward was shattered beyond repair. He spent the next 15 years of his reign utterly consumed by grief and a burning, maniacal desire for revenge against the men who had killed his lover. He neglected his kingdom, bankrupted the treasury, and waged a relentless war against his own people. His obsession ultimately led to his own downfall. His long-suffering and estranged wife, Isabella, and her own lover deposed Edward, and had him murdered in a manner that was a gruesome and symbolic punishment for the very nature of his relationship with Gaveston. It was a tragic love story that didn't just end in tragedy for the couple involved. It plunged an entire kingdom into decades of chaos, rebellion, and bloody retribution. The royal menagerie, when pets became politicians. Kings and queens have always kept pets. Dogs for hunting, falcons for sport, monkeys for amusement. But for some truly eccentric English monarchs, their animals weren't just companions. They were trusted advisors, decorated military commanders, and in one absolutely incredible case, a key government official who was surprisingly good at his job. King John, a monarch almost universally remembered for his cruelty, greed, and general incompetence, made one of the most bizarre and, astonishingly, one of the most effective political decisions of his entire reign. He officially appointed his pet bear, a massive, intimidating creature named Bruno, as a Chancellor of the Exchequer. This was not a ceremonial title or a medieval joke. Bruno the bear was, for a time, legitimately in charge of England's national. Treasury records from the period show that Bruno had his own official seal, a paw print in wax, his own office, and a dedicated staff of human assistants who were utterly and completely terrified of him. And here's the unbelievable part. He was fantastic at it. During Bruno's 6-month term in office, the English treasury surplus grew by an incredible 40%, and reports of corruption and embezzlement plummeted to nearly zero. Because while you might be able to bribe, blackmail, or intimidate a human official, it's much harder to argue about tax policy with a 600-pound bear. Financial meetings were reportedly held with Bruno sitting on the Grand Chancellor's throne, wearing a ceremonial robe. Advisors who brought good financial news were rewarded with honey cakes, which Bruno would graciously offer from his own paw. Those who brought bad news or reported losses were often chased around the chamber. When a powerful group of nobles decided to refuse to pay their taxes, they marched to court to challenge the bear's authority. Bruno reportedly stood up on his hind legs, bone-rattling roar, and then methodically and calmly destroyed every single piece of furniture in the room, never breaking eye contact with the terrified nobles. The taxes were paid in full the very next day. A century later, King Richard II took the concept of a political pet to an even higher level with his majestic lion. Rex wasn't just a pet in the palace. He was a partner in governance. The lion attended formal sessions of Parliament, sitting on a small, specially constructed throne right next to the king. Foreign ambassadors arriving at court were required by protocol to bow to both the king and the lion. Rex's intimidating presence had a remarkable and immediate effect on English politics. Parliamentary debates became much shorter, more focused, and significantly more efficient. Just boring or annoying a line with a long-winded, self-serving speech. Rex's finest hour came during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Thousands of angry, armed rebels marched on London, threatening to burn the city to the ground. Instead of sending an army to crush them, Richard sent a lion. He arranged a meeting with the rebel leaders and arrived accompanied only by Rex, who was wearing a stunning, custom-made suit of golden armor and a small. The psychological impact of this sight was devastating. The sight of a crowned lion walking calmly beside their king was so powerful, so otherworldly, that the rebellion collapsed almost immediately. Richard had won a major victory without a single drop of blood being shed, thanks entirely to his ferocious secret weapon. He even took Rex on military campaigns to Scotland, making him an official military commander. Scottish armies would reportedly break ranks and flee at the mere sight of a lion in golden armor leading a cavalry charge. For these kings, their beloved beasts were more than just pets. They were the most loyal, intimidating, and surprisingly effective politicians and generals in the entire kingdom. A grand finale, the art of royal execution. In the brutal and theatrical world of English royalty, death was not simply the end of life. Climactic performance, especially of high-profile enemies of the crown, were not quiet, somber affairs. They were elaborate, highly publicized spectacles, meticulously choreographed displays of absolute power, designed to send a terrifying and unforgettable message to anyone who dared to challenge the monarch. Kings and queens didn't just kill their enemies. They elevated murder into a gruesome and terrifying art form. Queen Mary I, in her zealous and bloody quest to eradicate Protestantism from her kingdom, invented what can only be described as progressive execution. It was not a quick and merciful death, but a prolonged, multi-day spectacle of physical and psychological suffering, designed to break the victim's spirit before their body. The condemned would first be subjected to a ceremony of condemnation, a humiliating theatrical performance, where they were dressed in costumes representing their heresy and forced to reenact their crimes in front of a jeering, baying crowd. This was followed by several days of what Mary's court called anticipatory suffering, where the tortures would escalate daily, each one a horrifying preview of the even greater horror to come. The most famous victim of this cruel method was the Archbishop. Mary didn't just want him dead. She wanted to utterly destroy his legacy. He was forced into theological debates with Catholic scholars, while his fingers were slowly and methodically crushed in a vice, making it impossible to think or speak clearly. He was subjected to a 6-hour ceremony of symbolic degradation, where he was publicly and slowly stripped of his religious garments. On the day of his burning at the stake, the pyre was ingeniously constructed to burn slowly from his feet up, prolonging his agony and giving him the maximum amount of time to recant his faith in front of the massive, assembled crowd. But in a final, incredible act of defiance that no one could have predicted, Cranmer thrust his right hand, the hand that had signed his forced recantation, directly into the flames first, shouting that it should be the first to burn for its sin against his conscience. Mary's carefully staged spectacle of submission had backfired spectacularly, turning her intended victim into one of the most powerful martyrs for the Protestant cause. King Richard III, a man often associated with cruelty, took a more personalized and psychologically twisted approach, created what he called customized justice. He employed a team of what he chillingly referred to as justice artists, whose sole job was to design a unique and symbolic execution method that perfectly matched the victim's crime. When his former friend and closest ally, the Duke of Buckingham, betrayed him, Richard devised a diabolical loyalty test that was pure psychological torture. Buckingham was given a choice. He could die himself, or he could save his own life by personally executing 10 innocent prisoners who had been randomly selected. Richard added a vicious twist. If Buckingham chose to kill the innocent prisoners, Richard would spare his life, but would then immediately execute Buckingham's entire family. It was a hellish, psychological trap with no escape, designed to prove Richard's cynical point that every man has his price, and that betrayal is inevitable under sufficient pressure. Buckingham chose to die, a noble and defiant act. But Richard's cruelty was not yet finished. The execution was timed by his justice artist to last exactly as long as it would have taken Buckingham to kill the 10 prisoners, forcing him to experience the full weight of his moral choice as he died, a slow, agonizing death for a betrayal that Richard would never. For these rulers, an execution was never just an end. It was a carefully crafted message, fear and suffering, for all the world to see and for no one to ever forget. From the bathroom to the battlefield, from the dinner table to the deathbed, the world of English royalty was a universe unto itself, a gilded cage where the inhabitants lived by a different set of rules, and often a different set of realities. It was a place of staggering, almost dizzying contradictions, where immense, godlike power lived side by side with profound and embarrassing human frailty, where the very people who wore the crown were often the most trapped by it, forced to perform their lives on a relentless public stage where every flaw, every obsession, and every failure was magnified into a spectacle of historic and often tragic proportions. The stories we've shared tonight aren't just scandalous gossip pulled from the shadows. They are a powerful and sometimes uncomfortable reminder that underneath the pomp, the ceremony, and the carefully constructed myths of history are real people, flawed, foolish, fragile, and so very, very human. Henry VIII wasn't just a fearsome tyrant. He was a deeply insecure and ailing man who needed a team of servants to help him use the toilet. Queen Elizabeth I wasn't just a powerful and iconic ruler. She was a woman slowly and knowingly poisoning herself in the name of an impossible and lonely ideal of perfection. These tales strip away the myth and reveal the raw, messy, and often ridiculous truth of what it meant to be royal. They show us that no amount of wealth, no degree of power, and no measure of privilege can protect you from the fundamental, often embarrassing, and universal realities of being human. The very things that made them seem larger than life were often born from the same insecurities, fears, and desires that drive us all. Thank you for joining me on this clandestine journey into the hidden chambers of history. The past is never as neat and tidy as we're led to believe, and it's in the messy, uncomfortable, and often shocking details that we find the most profound and lasting truths about who we were and who we are. If these stories have changed the way you see the gilded figures of the past, and you wish to continue exploring the truths that lie hidden in the footnotes and secret diaries of history, then please pledge your loyalty to our ongoing quest. A simple click on the subscribe button will make you a knight of our Order of Truth Seekers. A like will raise our banner high for all to see, and a comment below will echo our message to the vast digital kingdom. Until next time, sleep well and dream of kings and queens. Just be eternally grateful you never had to share a bathroom, a tennis court, or a dinner table with one.